Welcome to Let's Talk Justice, the program of Jamaicans for Justice. And I just want to say before we even introduce ourselves, thank you so much to our viewers, those who are on the road, in their homes, those who are watching online via YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Michael Jackson, Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice.
So today is Tuesday, March 14th. It's certainly good to be back home, especially so before the immigration officers went on strike. So at least I wasn't stuck in the airport as some persons were. So that is good news.
Yes, it is good. It is good.
You enjoyed yourself last week without me?
Well, you know,
you had to suffer through the participation of Patrick Layla.
You know, I will say it was different. I'm not gonna diss Patrick on the air.
We won't. He's a very good friend of ours, so I have privilege of doing that.
Okay.
But thank you for leading charge, and certainly Patrick Layla, guest host, co-host rather, and Carleen McCollum. I managed to. My internet was not good last week.
I was wondering if you were able to catch it.
No, I saw a few snippets.
Okay.
So, very good job by you all. Thank you. All right. So, I made light just now of the immigration officers, but it's certainly nothing for us to laugh about. And as we touch on the human rights issues in the week, the matter of people going on strike, industrial action, we saw a lot of that. The Jamaica Teachers Association and a couple of the employees within the public service went on strike last week. So it is something for us to look at in terms of what those provisions are. And I know you will touch on that briefly, Jade, when you come to your right. But there are some other things. Just to point out that a state of emergency was declared at midnight, last night, if you will, for two parishes in its entirety, Clarendon and St. James. And I found it interesting when you look at the overall murder rate that I think the last time we heard it was 54 murders less, which is very, very good news. So I'm a little bit interested in reading a little bit more as to the reasoning for another set of SOEs being declared. But that is something for us to watch. There are some other things that jumped out at me. I'm not sure if you saw the mandatory minimum statement from the two justices.
Yes, I did see them. And I have to, well, certainly with some of the statements coming from Justice Sykes in particular, I have to agree. I think it's something that we would have expounded on before.
The backlogs and reversing all of those.
Yes, and you in particular did make that statement about the plea bargaining and how that is beneficial to the clearing of that backlog. So the incentivization that we would have had in our current set of provisions is seemingly not as valuable to our legislators as we would have hoped it to be.
Or you know, I'm not sure if it's valuable. It's one of those things in our Westminster model wherein, you know, you have to be playing to the gallery to suggest that you're doing something. But, you know, JFJ will be speaking more on this. And from the last time we did mention, for example, that a joint select committee will be convened reviewing the proposed mandatory minimums. But what was interesting coming from Justice Patrick Brooks was that there are certain offenses that if you impose mandatory minimums, in his estimation, they may very well be deemed unconstitutional, which is something I found interesting. I was hoping that Justice Brooks would have expounded a little bit more in terms of what some of those offenses may or may not be. But again, this is something for us to watch keenly. Another good news coming out of last week, this is something that we have been talking about, and it's an indictment on successive governments, actually. An indictment on those who are responsible in terms of not really pushing that sense of nationalism when it comes to serving on the jury. And we're seeing less people participating in that regard.
Yes.
And we have also stated very practically that when you have informal workers making up a significant percentage of your population, for example, a day's worker. If I work for the day doing domestic duties and I get what, $5,000, $6,000. You call me on jury duty, there's no sick days, no jury leave or anything that I can get.
Yes.
And you're giving me a mere ridiculous $2,000. There is no way on God's earth I will be turning up.
Mm-hmm.
No way.
Yeah.
Especially when you look at some of these cases that can very well be put my life at risk. So I'm happy that Cabinet, though years behind, sorry to be given and taken back, but it's just ridiculous for me that some things, it takes the public conversation to have rather than Parliament and the executive branch doing their work to realize that $2,000 made absolutely no sense. Every day you hear about taxi men want, and by the way, whether or not the government granted tax if you're going up, right? $2,000 is completely insufficient. So we look forward to what that proposed amount would be, certainly. I'm not sure if anything else jumped out at you last week that was of interest.
No, not last week. I did see some things the week before concerning some children. And it brought back to mind the consistent and reform conversation around the Child Care and Protection Act and around related acts that serve to provide criminal provisions for children, and how best we can align those with, for example, our international obligations to the rights of children. But just generally to ensure that children are being given the opportunity to contribute to society, So
I would love to have a Children's Day, not youth now. As youth, I was youth a few years ago, up to 34. I think I passed the youth category by United Nations. Now moving towards the big 4-0, a couple of years from it, but close enough. But I would love for some teenagers to have a say in Parliament. For example, my son, he has spoken very strongly. Some of the things I don't agree with in principle, I can't say on the air, but he has spoken very strongly on things like age of consent and how ridiculous that people keep talking about it rather than really dealing with public education. So I'm happy you said that. But there was something else that jumped out at me last week with the one man. Is one done gang trial?
Yes, it's one done.
We've seen conviction of 15 of 33.
Yes. 17
were acquitted and 1 died during the process. And the government, rightfully so, they have been applauding themselves with the anti-gang legislation that was passed. But what was interesting to me is the conversation coming from the Minister of National Security in terms of what offenses should be heard by judges only, whether or not should be one judge versus a panel versus the jury. When you look at cost in terms of, sequestering jurors if there is risk. So it's a conversation to be had. But funny enough, a couple of months ago, people were all chastising the Chief Justice, but now they're quite happy with him. Yes. So it's an interesting thing to really watch. But those are some of the things that really jumped out at me. Many, many more. It was an active news cycle while I was away catching my phone to one side to get the internet. But yeah.
Yes.
Those are some of the things.
I mean, the other thing that caught me, I wouldn't discuss on JFJ's show.
But you piqued my interest.
We'll talk at the break. So I'm going to go straight into our right of the day, which I think is topical. So we are talking about actually collective bargaining. So while we have a right to freedom of association, I think we've spoken about that right on the show before, we don't have a right to strike as a general right. So the strike action is qualified, and it can only be legally used where it is not in breach of an employment contract. So there are certain conditions that should be met. For example, you need to give notice, or you can use your sick days or other leave that is available to you. But as far as just getting up and striking, as we would have seen in other jurisdictions where that right is much freer, less restricted.
And it's interesting because when you look at Jamaica's history, I always mention the 1938 labor riots and what it pushed. It's interesting that we don't have that provision in terms of right to strike. So people have the flu. right? It's, when I listen to, for example, public service servants calling in and coughing in the phone and so on. I'm happy that nobody at JFJ, they have caught any bug. But, I just want to, I'm happy this particular right comes up in this conversation, because I remember persons online chastising some of the public servants about striking, and if you remember that National Water Commission strike last year.
Yes.
Last year it was, yeah.
Yeah. It brings to mind, I've seen the strike action in the UK, and one thing that I have found inspiring, and I hope that we can take some inspiration from it as a nation as well, is the support of just the general public. They are inconvenienced, and there are dissenting voices to the
public
strike action
servants have my full support, and I have no fear of contradiction in saying that on air.
Yeah. So that's what I hope that we can take something from that as well, to support our public servants as they lobby for better conditions for work.
Yes.
I'll just do our trivia real quick. If you could just blast that up for me, producer. So we are doing, what is the oldest trade union in the history of Jamaica? So it's A, Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, B, the Union of Clerical, Administrative and Supervisory Employees, and C, the Jamaica's Teacher Association. So if you know the correct answer, you can send it to our Instagram page at JA for Justice, and the winner will receive a free credit courtesy of JFJ.
All right. So on the matter of trade union, we're going to be joined by Vincent Morrison, who is the president of UCAS. He's a trade unionist, obviously, and also Cadre Folks, who is an attorney at law. And we're going to be having a discussion on the Occupational Safety and Health Act.
Yes.
A bill. And for those who listen to the throne speech and pay keen attention to these things, the Governor General, Sir Patrick Allen, would have opened Parliament to indicate that the OSHA bill is on the legislative agenda for the year. Persons within civil society like myself were not necessarily impressed by that announcement, because for those who don't know, the OSHA is over 2 decades being spoken of, from the 1990s. And I took the liberty before the show, Jade, to do a quick Google search. And every single year, the OSHA bill will be passed.
Yes.
And to put in context, though, it was tabled in the House of Parliament in 2017. There was a joint select committee that was established. So the bill is there.
Yes.
It's for Parliament to act. I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that before we take the break at 1:15.
No, well, in terms of just the history of the bill, not on that point. I do have some key provisions from the bill that I would go over when we come back from the break.
Okay. And just lastly to note that we have a Factories Act. I believe it was established in the 1940s.
Yes.
There's a regulations in 61. And that's for people working in the big old factory them with machine and all of them something there. But people like me now who are not so physically fit, we use our minds, right? So we sit beside the computer or in front of the computer, we nearly go blind, which is why we're wearing the glasses. So the question is the Factories Act, as thought of before, fitting the current reality of a service-oriented industry? So we're going to be having the conversation again with Vincent Morrison and Cadre Folks, but we take the break and then we return. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. For those who are listening in, just to remind you that you can call the studio lines at 676-4996, or you can give us a WhatsApp message at 239-7583. So, as we stated before the break, the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, a bill, is currently going to be considered for 2023. So after over 2 decades of delay, again, it's back on the legislative agenda for Parliament. So we're going to be discussing some of the key provisions, what employees and employers can look forward to. And we're joined by trade unionist Vincent Morrison and attorney at law Cadre Folks. Welcome to you both.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon, dear listeners.
Thank you so much. Let me start with you, Mr. Morrison. Over 2 decades, what is your feedback to the Governor General indicating that Parliament will be prioritizing same for passage this year?
Well, as you know, this draft legislation has been on the shelf of the Labour Ministry and perhaps Parliament for, as you say, 2 decades or more. What is strange is that when I was a member of the that body that sits with the minister, the Labour Advisory Council, that council had actually settled the issue, both the Jamaican Chorus Federation, the union sit on that council. And we had done a lot of work. There was one issue that was giving us a problem. And what I can say is 20 odd years ago, that issue was settled. And that was the right for the workers to refuse. You ask your job, you don't have the proper equipment, the proper tools, etc. You had the right to refuse.
Yes.
So I am happy to hear that the dust is being blown off. And that, because, I know for a fact that on construction sites, a lot of workers have lost their lives or have been injured without any suitable compensation because they are not given the right safety equipment, etc. I know that in agriculture, I can recall some issues in the sugar industry where, the worker was spraying cane and grass and what have you with some very dangerous chemicals. There's a set of chemicals they call it dirty dust that was banned in almost every country except Jamaica. And that was being used here. And of course, the whole issue of the worker wearing the same clothes that he worked in on the farm. He did a spray, takes it to his house. It's washing the same clothes with the other clothes, baby clothes, what have you. So all of these safeguards, we would have had these safeguards. In fact, the security guard who got killed at JN, bank in Portmore, if the law was in place, the right to refuse, he could have said, look, I don't have the proper vest or the arrangement that I am working with is not safe.
And it's interesting that you said that. I'm going to shift over to Jade to allow Kadra to speak. But it's interesting that you said that because I remember persons blaming the security guard to say that he wasn't perhaps paying attention and that sort of a statement coming out, which is unfortunate. But thank you so much for outlining that.
Yeah, so the whole question of training is very important.
Mm-hmm.
But let me just say something quickly. We are not a safe society. We are not safe in the home. We are not safe on the street. We are not safe at the workplace. And I think we have a long climb to make to even normalize the whole issue of health and safety arrangements in this country.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Morrison. Kadra, I hear Mr. Morrison talking about Section 84, which is the right to cease unsafe work, which I think is an interesting and useful addition to any kind of labor provisions. And I was wondering if there was anything else that you saw from your desk in terms of what would be new protections coming into the Occupational Safety and Health Act that you think we should highlight.
All right. First of all, I just want to make it clear exactly what it is that we're talking about. So occupational safety and health is concerned with identifying hazards to work and also trying to assess the risk associated with those hazards and implementing control measures. So it's a new dimension. The Factories Act speaks to physical safety at work for the most part, how it is that the worker is interacting with the built environment. But the hazards at work are far beyond just physical. You have biological hazards like viruses like COVID-19, even the regular flu. You have chemical hazards, right? You have ergonomic hazards, and you have psychosocial hazards. So from the outset, occupational safety and health is proposing to just shift the entire game in terms of how we conceive of safety and health in Jamaica. So that is the main thing, the scope of that legislation. The other thing I want to highlight is the fact that, also in terms of scope, is who it's going to apply to. Now, the Factories Act is part of our gamut of labor laws in Jamaica. And traditional labor regulation is always concerned with the employer-employee relationship. So if you're not an employee, labor laws don't apply to you. And we're in a space where a lot of workers are not employees. They're considered to be contractors, or more so independent contractors.
Yes.
It's a whole next problem on its own.
Yes. And so occupational safety and health has the foresight to address that, because whereas if someone is not paid minimum wage, or a woman is not given paid maternity leave, there are no dire consequences. You can go and adjudicate in the courts. But with occupational safety and health, we're talking about people's lives. Lives can be lost. And so the policy behind the scope of the law is that it's to apply to all workers. And so if you look at that definition of worker, it starts with a reference to the employee, which is who the traditional labor laws normally stop at. But occupational safety and health goes beyond that and says any contractor, any subcontractor, any apprentice, anybody who works for like a labor hire company. Because in terms of how work is being organized now, sometimes we can't even put a worker into a space as to whether they're employer independent contractor.
Add to that domestic workers who are protected under this act, which I think is our first time.
Yes, specifically they are referred to. And that's because, so the issue with domestic workers is that usually labor law is regulating an exchange where there's a business that's a going concern, and business is operated for profit vis-a-vis a worker who is selling their labor for money, right? But in the domestic space, it's not for profit, the undertaking in terms of from the employer. And so how USH has been able to accommodate the domestic worker in particular, but other issues as well, is that you are not going to find in the Occupational Safety and Health Bill a reference to employer. And that's because employer will limit the scope of the law in terms of who, because employer is understood in conjunction with like employee, right? And because the scope of this legislation is proposed to be so wide, you have a concept which is being introduced called the PCBU, or the person conducting a business or undertaking.
Yes.
So generally, work is carried out in the context of business. But domestic work is carried out in the domestic space where the person who employs a domestic worker is not in business, right? It's a domestic situation. So in order to capture that kind of undertaking, then the laws came up with the PCB, or the person conducting a business, as opposed to an undertaking, whereby it's not an activity that's generating profit, but it utilizes labor, and that labor is to be protected. There are quite a few.
I actually have a specific one I want to ask you about. So I did look at it, looking at the discrimination provision under section 104, and I see a protection, for example, for not engaging with the person at all. So you have not engaged with them as yet. You haven't contracted them. They're not an employee as yet. And then you are now protected from being refused that engagement on a certain basis. Can you break down that provision for us?
All right, so the law is really trying to raise the bar in terms of how we treat with safety and health. And it's signaling that you cannot, because someone has a safety and health concern, and for instance, you're interviewing them and they said, okay, want me to do that. And based on my experience, this is what is required, right? And so I expect the law will say that you're to provide, because that's what the law says in terms of whatever is needed to ensure the safety of the worker is to be provided or provided for. So you cannot refuse to employ someone because of safety concerns, because another worker is going to have a similar concern. Because if that is what is required objectively to carry out the work safely, then it's needed. And so from the outset, the law is trying to reorient how we conceive of safety and health, because what it would mean, therefore, is that worker is able to make a complaint, or a prospective worker, and get redress. And indirectly, that's protecting another worker who might be inclined to sell themselves short and then undertake to do the work. Because we hear it sometimes from time to time in the media where a worker, for instance, is to carry out a job that requires them to go underground, right, for a well, or to work in a well or something like that. And I can recall one in particular where one worker went down. They were independent contractors, right? So they were not employees of this entity, but they want to eat a food, all right? So they might hustle. And there's this work to be done that's underground. And one went down, was unresponsive, got into difficulty. The other, not appreciating the hazard associated with that job, went down to assist, and he also encountered difficulty. And the third person went for help, thankfully. And that is because those persons did not appreciate the hazards associated with that job. And that below ground level, at a certain depth, there's no oxygen. And so you'd have needed like an oxygen tank or a mask or whatever the case is, right?
Miss Folks, I'm going to ask you just to pause for that thought, and when we return, I want us to pick up on the public education concerns around things like what you're outlining, and how we move forward, and we'll get the perspective of Mr. Morrison as well. So we take the break at this time. Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We are here with Vincent Morrison, trade unionist and Casual Folks attorney at law, and we're discussing the Occupational Safety and Health Bill that hopefully will be passed by the House of Parliament for 2023. Ms. Folks was speaking earlier about the provisions and areas around, safety standards, what do we qualify and so on in terms of the different risks that people face. So I want to pick up with you, Mr. Morrison. What are some of the necessary next steps, the preemptive things that ought to be done when it comes to educating employees, persons like domestic workers and so on some of these provisions, so they really understand when we talk about occupational safety, what it means? What will you will be doing?
To answer that question directly,
yes,
I would want to say maybe the most important thing that ought to be done going forward is to ensure that the law is in place. Right? The point that the President talks about is woefully inadequate. The second point is that the Ministry of Labour, who's supposed to be monitoring the whole sector of inspection and so forth, they are woefully limited in terms of the numbers of persons they have in that department. So you have out there a lot of breaches, a lot of dangers that, people are just lucky to survive.
Before you continue your point, Mr. Morrison, I want to just plug here. That's what I share those concerns in part because I remember we have been waiting for years, and Kadra, you can back me up here. We have been waiting for years for the Disability Act to be enforced. It finally now is. It was the Valentine's Day gift for people. But when you walk along the roadway in places of employment and so on, you get a sense that people aren't complying. And we're not sure what is really being done to ensure that that compliance is there. So I just wanted to plug that, Mr. Morrison, before you continued, that it really has implications for other pieces of legislation as well.
And it don't make sense to spend 20 years in putting an act together, a law together. And we don't know what it's all about. And those persons who are supposed to be doing this or doing that, they're not doing it because maybe not out of the spite, but because they just don't know about it. So the issue has to be whether you're working with a domestic servant or domestic employee or whatever, you're supposed to know about the potential hazard to which you may be exposed at the workplace.
Yes.
You must be able to participate in the process, right? Identifying and solving the concern. Right? As I said, it's very, very important because when you look on the last time the accident in the workplace, when you look on what we have been spending regarding accidents on the road, the crashes, it is awesome. And we could save a lot of time and money if we do the basic thing, education.
Before we switch to Miss Folks, and I know Jade has a pressing question. You mentioned that you've been getting breaches within from where you sit. Do you have those breaches documented in terms of how many and the types of breaches that you've gotten those complaints about?
That question is for me?
Yes, Mr. Morrison, please.
No, unfortunately, we couldn't pull a file and say, this is reach 1, 2, 3. Unfortunately.
All right, thank you so much.
All right. Yes, thank you, Mr. Morrison. Miss Folks, so I wanted to ask about the redress options that are available should there be a breach under the bill. Because when Mikhail mentioned the disabilities issue, the same thing came to mind, is that there is a certain level of compliance that's expected from the actors under the provisions, and when they don't comply, what can you do as a person who is affected by that non-compliance?
All right. Well, first of all, in terms of enforcement under the bill, there is less of a focus on taking anybody to court. The emphasis is on compliance and keeping workers safe. And so you will see in the bill that there is reference to some administrative type of notices. Like, for instance, if a safety officer goes into a workplace and they cite something, they can issue an improvement notice, or you can have like a non-disturbance notice, for instance, if there is an accident scene at a workplace. So the purpose of these notices is really to ensure compliance with the law. So as a first step, when breach is observed, the emphasis of occupational safety and health is not to punish. As a matter of fact, this is one of those laws where, based on the scheme of the law in terms of enforcement mechanism, it is appropriate for the law to be implemented with the understanding that there's going to be a period of transition, because the scheme of the law allows for that. It's only after you're cited, and in that citation, those notices, the safety officer has to identify what is wrong and make recommendations as to how to address them and give you a time frame. Okay. It's only after you have not done those things that the matter is escalated. And so for some breaches, you might have a ticketing system similar to like a road traffic offense, where you can be required to pay an amount, right, which is determined administratively. And it's only if it is that after your hand has been held as an employer or an occupational safety and health specialist, and there's no compliance, that the entity will actually be taken before the court for those proceedings. So I hope I've answered your question where that is concerned.
I actually just wanted to follow up with, is it when we say court, just for our listeners, are we talking a regular court? Are we talking a tribunal like it is under some other bills, or?
Well, yes. It's all right. So the tribunal, for the purposes of this law, is really going to be the Industrial Disputes Tribunal. Okay. But in serious cases, the matter could go before a parish court. I mean, there was some discussion as to, for instance, you can have like corporate crimes. And those crimes can be in relation like to the death of a worker. But I'm not sure if the policy on that was settled, but the last thing I recall was that there was a thinking that there should be no criminal prosecution under this law. But that could have changed. I'm not aware. I'm not sitting at the Ministry of Labour.
Because I don't want to bring my socialist conversations in this dialogue, Kadra. But we live in a capitalist economy where people, as best as possible, try to keep all their costs low, unfortunately to the detriment of employees. And while I appreciate that the law has to focus on, ensuring that people, the minds and hearts change, when it comes to people's fundamental rights, though, I'm not too sure if that's sufficient, if you will, especially for companies who can afford to pay and ignore some of these small fines.
So I agree with you. This is life and death.
Yes. But you have what is called corporate social responsibility. So it's really like trying to bring about behavior change, because the fact of the matter is that if your company is in, there's always some sort of, media response to certain things. And so even just the response from the public alone, in terms of you not being mindful of your corporate social responsibility, that in and of itself can also bring some pressure to bear on certain entities, and not so much about fining people.
So we have to hope that the cancel culture works.
Well, I guess so, yes. In a sense. But the point is this: occupational safety and health, the focus is not, and that's why, I'm really not understanding why it is that employers would push back, because if you really look at this law, it's really trying to orient us towards being more safety conscious. Always, when you're looking at jobs to be carried out, look at the hazards, identify hazards. So you need to be educated or have the personnel who are educated to identify, assess the risk, and then you're either gonna try to eliminate or you try to minimize, and then you implement these control measures. The emphasis is on compliance and ensuring safety. The emphasis so much is not on punishment, but where that is necessary, that can be meted out.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Folks. Last word to you, Mr. Morrison, as we have to close out now. Anything you want to close out with?
We need to strengthen the culture and health and safety in Jamaica. The whole issue of the right to know about potential hazards to which workers may be exposed while at the workplace. This can make a big difference, not only in our economic growth, but, we can save a lot of time, a lot of pain, and I think the time is right for us to get the country all around this thing. Just like what we did about the seatbelt act years ago.
Yes.
I understand the seatbelt act is the most compliant law we have in Jamaica. We can do it, and it needs the participation or the participatory approach of the country.
All right. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Vincent Morrison, trade unionist, and Kadra Folks, attorney at law. Kadra, Jade was saying, by the way, that you're quite knowledgeable. She's in awe. So we certainly appreciate both your presence here today, and we will talk again soon. We'll take the break.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We just had, I think, a very interesting conversation about occupational safety and health, and reminding our listeners that if you want to recap anything that you hear on the show is posted on our YouTube channel, Jamaicans for Justice, so you can always go over and see anything that we discussed.
But while our guests were speaking, Jade, one of the things that came to mind was COVID-19. And some of the concerns that employees had when work from home was done. And I remember we were joking before, as employees ourselves, what are some of the requirements, whether or not I should get some funding for printer, a proper chair at my house. And funny enough, there were a couple of private sector companies that actually provided some allowances for their employees to deal with those sort of ergonomics, if you will. So it's something to really be looking at. But while we were online, I saw an article that I found with great interest coming to the public. It was in the Jamaica Observer and another media house that man files lawsuit on behalf of Jamaicans to boot police commissioner. That's the headline of the Jamaica Observer. And that person is an entertainment blogger and record producer, Wayne Brown, who has filed a civil lawsuit in the Supreme Court against the Public Services Commission and the Police Services Commission, he says, on behalf of the Jamaican people, because in his estimation, the police commissioner has not been doing effective work in reducing the crime rate.
Okay.
And the basis upon which the lawsuit was filed against the two commissions is that, I'm trying to find the exact wording here, is that the police commissioner and the police commission rather, and the public service commission, they have not been doing their own due diligence to ensure that our right to life is being sufficiently protected. And the case or the suit is asking for the court to adjudicate upon a case which is critical to national security. And that's a quote from Mr. Wayne Brown. I found that quite interesting, that this civil suit has been filed on behalf of the Jamaican citizenry.
Well, well, having not seen the exact pleadings, I reserve an opinion on
I have none. I'm just reading the article.
on its effect. But I am interested. I would be very interested, actually, to know the exact basis of the cause of action, what exactly the pleadings are, what their cases that they're going to rely on are. Very interesting to hear.
Yes. And JFJ, we have been quite reserved in our approaches to when we call for resignation. It's not something I personally believe should just be called for. Not to say that it has no merit in this situation. I have no opinion on it.
Yes.
Having, again, not read anything in detail.
Yes.
But I think when we talk about accountability, I think we also have to be looking at the resources that are being provided to agencies and to individuals, whether or not the resources coming from the parliament, the executive branch, they're sufficient. What are some of the other support mechanisms that exist, especially to deal with crime, which is such a complex issue.
Of course.
Yeah, so I look forward to reading more, but I said, wow. Yeah, when I saw the article, really.
Well, one thing I can say that I can appreciate that has been trending in our kind of social action, I think. I think citizens are in a position right now where a lot of persons are taking some kind of action. We are seeing our industrial action taking place.
You're glad there, let me not be naughty, but again, a very brave man. He's a sergeant. He was a former JDF officer. He's now a firefighter. And he went on top of the transportation center, the very pinnacle of it. And he was waving his flag from as early as when I was coming to work this morning. I saw it, which was about 9, after 8 thereabout, and it was close to 12 noon that he came down. By the way, he's very skilled, he's very brave. Kudos to him. But I think he brought attention to the issues of what firefighters face daily. And, we may not go that extreme, because I can't climb from here to there. But I think when it comes to matter of citizen participation in the process, it's something that we really need to re-energize around. I really believe in political participation, which for me, Jade, last week, one of the political parties, the People's National Party, they released a poll that was commissioned by Don Anderson.
Yes.
And what was evident in that poll is that there are high levels of voter apathy. And it's very clear. 2016 general elections, I believe it was 53% of us participated or less. 2020, it was 37%. We can't blame COVID, but again, it's trending down. How interested are we in these things, and how do we, again, energize the population?
I go back to the same Don Anderson, because I think it was last week, Sunday, or sometime early last week. He did a short editorial, very short, speaking about the issue and the voter apathy issue. And he pointed out something that I feel like I'm constantly saying to you as well. People are tired of not seeing anything happen when they make their interests known. So the apathy is coming from a lack of confidence. That has to be one of the factors. So I think our political actors need to take stock of that, because
The only time you see them is election time when they're looking some votes.
yes, and it's indicative of a lack of trust between the citizenry and their interests and the leadership. So I think that's something we have to take greater stock of.
I agree. And I think we can make a public call here to both leaders of the political party and in their parliamentary functions, for them to utilize the relevant ministries to educate people more. And I don't mean the politicking in your nicely, brightly colored shirts and hats. I mean really explaining to people. I remember going to UE and I was always listening to budget debates, you know, and so on. I don't see that anymore. So how do we get the public energized and educated on the things? Because it can only serve us. You know, I think we need much more from our parliamentarians and, dare I say, the youth organizations that support the respective political parties. I don't think they're doing enough, and they're doing a disservice to their fellow youngsters.
Absolutely. You know, I've recently heard a criticism about that, because I was speaking with a youth leader that was basically expressing their apathy as well, and their disinterest in continuing in the area of like youth advocacy, and that was one of their criticisms, that engaging with those youth, I'm not going to name which, but engaging with the youth organizations associated with the parties left them feeling even more apathetic. They think that there's a lot more that can be done in terms of the kinds of engagement.
And they just regurgitate the rhetoric of the political actors rather than bringing something fresh and new.
Yeah, and unfortunately, based on that account at least, that new ideas are not necessarily so accepted in that space, which you'd hope that the youth arm is where new ideas have an ability to thrive.
More liberal perspectives and so on to push forward some of these laws that, quite frankly, a lot of our parliamentarians have demonstrated complete ineptitude in passing. So, I think we need to do a little bit more, but we can continue to play our role with this particular show. Right?
Well, yes, we'll do our best here at Jamaicans for Justice.
All right, over to you with your trivia.
Yes, so the winner of our trivia, I saw about 4 correct answers, but...
The timestamp, Karen?
Oh, okay. So I'm hearing that I'm hearing from the producer that he has not found the winner. So
can I have executive privilege and say if we had 4 correct responses and we can give all 4 credit?
Oh, I'm hearing that they're not correct.
Oh, they're not correct?
That's what I'm hearing.
Oh.
So I may have misread.
Let me see what's there.
So we don't have a winner yet. So for those of you who are listening, you can go to our Instagram page and respond to our trivia question in the comments. And our producer will reach out should you be successful in answering. So that was the show.
All right, so thank you so much, and please keep in tune to what is happening in the week. JFJ will provide update. Have a good day.